All right, let's get some analysis on this now. We're joined by international relations expert Brooks Spector. Brooks, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on. A number of issues raised there by the minister, but of course, overall, let's talk about this UN resolution. One, how significant and how critical is it that the non-permanent members and the permanent members have all now agreed on a framing of a resolution that is able to insert a word ceasefire in it?
Well, I think it's important, but just we should also recall that just a couple of days ago, the United States introduced a resolution which would have called for many of the same things, but had a stronger condemnation of Hamas in its activities. And that wasn't, of course, vetoed by both Russia and China. So this resolution, this version, in which the United States doesn't vote for it, but abstains from voting, in a particular and narrow kind of way, represents a kind of compromise. And in that sense, your minister is accurate. But the framing of the immediate history is important too. This also, I think, and it's important to note, represents an evolution, not a revolution, but an evolution, an evolving position by the United States on how it relates as a government to the current government in Israel. And you'll note that the Israeli Defense Minister, Minister Gallant, is in the U.S. now, I believe his plane has touched down, but a defense group from that government is now no longer coming, and this begins to speak to the division between the Israeli government in its present circumstances and the United States. Add one more thing, that the United States is in the process of building or assembling to build an artificial pier which would allow for much more efficient and certainly much larger amounts of relief aid to be delivered. It would be assembled in the Mediterranean Sea on the coast and would allow larger ships to deliver supplies that had already been inspected and approved and so forth, and then allow them to be moved on for distribution. That's certainly more efficient than the airdropping of supplies, or even what has been a very painful process of moving relief supplies by truck through a border post, essentially truck by truck, and all the ways in which they have to be inspected. So it's an evolving version of the American position to what is beginning to be seen as a kind of an obdurate Israeli government, which is insistent on ending Hamas as a fighting force, but at a very steep cost to everybody else.
Would it not have been a much more significant evolution and a meaningful one, for example, if the United States voted for this resolution, but not only that, went further and actually added a permanent ceasefire, not only 2-week ceasefire, because essentially what that means, Israel could read that as, well, for 2 weeks there'll be a ceasefire, then after that we'll go back to what we were doing.
Well, no, I think step by step is the answer here. Every action like this is done so that you move the other side. You move someone towards something rather than simply waving a stick at them. And I think in the current circumstances, given the relationship between the two countries, pushing rather than pummeling is going to be the way to go forward. There's also, let me just add one other thing, and we need to keep it in mind. There is an influence of the American domestic political circumstances that is beginning to have the Biden administration bend away from its initial back Israel, we have your back in all ways, shapes, and forms, to we have to begin to do something to end this. And that's because a fair number of younger Democrats, people who are African or Muslim American, have expressed some significant displeasure with the American policy to date. And the election, I probably don't need to remind anybody in your viewership, but there's an American election for president coming up in November. So there's that push going on as well. What you're asking for is a complete 180-degree turn in American policy, and I don't think you see that very often.
So one of the issues that's being blamed, of course, in passing the ceasefire is this question on hostages. And there is a push for the 130 or so hostages to be released, but not such a strong push the other way around for the 7,000 plus, others are saying, that would have been taken hostage by Israel during this retaliatory attacks.
Well, there haven't been 7,000 people from Gaza taken hostage. There are some thousands of Palestinians who have been arrested and are currently incarcerated, presumably in accordance with legal processes. Whether you think they're fair and accurate or not is a different kind of question. But what's happening is that there is a proposal that is part of the negotiation that's been going on in Qatar and Cairo and presumably by telephone as well. And one of the ideas is that the hostages from Israel that were seized, those that are still alive, would be exchanged at I think the number, now I'm going to I'm subject to correction on this, that would be exchanged at something like a ratio of 1 Israeli to 5 or 6 Palestinians currently in Israeli hands, so that it would be an unequal exchange in one sense, but the Israelis presumably place a much higher value on getting those hostages back because of their own domestic political circumstances. Footnote here, too, it is not clear that the 130 or 140 hostages that were still remaining in Hamas or Islamic Jihad hands are still alive, and we don't know that, nor does anybody else apparently.
And what is then the I suppose the intervention 2 weeks from now that could see this situation permanently being in place? Because Benjamin Netanyahu is determined at this particular point to go on the ground in Rafah, and the United States would want him not to do so. How do they send a strong message enough to Benjamin Netanyahu that we don't want you to do that?
I would frame it this way. I think at this point, if you view the negotiations as something of a international tennis game, I think the ball was just hit over the net toward Hamas and its supporters. Okay, now what is it you are going to offer? And on that basis, that would determine to some degree whether the Netanyahu government decides to go full bore into the remaining southern portion of Gaza or not, or the Israeli government will decide, even if something is offered, it's insufficient. In other words, the ball is back over the other side of that net. They will determine that Hamas remains sufficiently a credible force that they have to do it anyway. My crystal ball is a little fuzzy at this point on this, and I'm not absolutely sure how that's going to play out. I don't think anybody is at this point.
Can Israel afford to ignore the resolution of the UN Security Council?
Well, they can afford to make motions in its direction. They can afford to not do everything that everybody else in the world wants. The one thing they can't afford to do, I think it's fair to say, is to ignore entirely the pressures that the Americans are bringing to bear on them, because the Americans still have a considerable portion of the supply chain of military materiel that the Israelis still need to complete whatever process they intend to do, as well as resupplying the Iron Dome anti-missile defense system. And that, of course, needs to be maintained because Hezbollah in the north has continued to send rockets, and there are apparently at least some rockets still in the hands of Hamas that might conceivably be fired. They can afford to, the Israelis can afford to reluctantly move in the direction of adhering to a 2-week ceasefire, even if they do not necessarily go along with the idea that this is simply the first step toward an entire ceasefire almost immediately. Again, I'm not sure just how the calculations are taking place in the Israeli Prime Minister's office or its foreign ministry or its Defense Department. I wish I knew. I think a lot of people wish they knew at this point.
14 other countries voted for this. I mean, does this represent strong enough collaboration between the countries to want that permanent ceasefire?
Well, remember, it's a resolution. Resolutions are interesting and important, but unless they're backed up with actions, they are resolutions. They are not do it or we will send in the Marines, do it or we will land the special forces, or we will cut off all trade universally. I mean, resolution is an expression of intent and belief and a vision of things, but it is not by itself an implementing element. And we have to see how much the Israelis take on board the idea that they did not get any joy today.
So you've already mentioned, of course, the high-level delegation to Washington that is excluding Netanyahu's administration. So they are not lending in the U.S. In light of this new position of the U.S. Is this a beginning of a new Israel-U.S. kind of relationship, or is it just temporary?
Well, I think it's a new page. It's not an entirely new relationship because, remember, the Biden administration has made no statements of disavowing its relationship with Israel, and in fact, in Congress, the House of Representatives, with a Republican majority of razor-thin proportions, there is a very strong sentiment to continue to support Israel to the extent that it possibly can. That in the Senate, perhaps a little less so, but there's no real indication within the American political structures or administrative structures that the ties that bind the two nations together are being frayed. What is happening, as I mentioned a little earlier, that there is, because there's an election, there is a calculation among the Biden administration folks, and Donald Trump too, for that matter, that this represents an issue which is delicate, which is awkward, which can have repercussions among the electorate, and already has in some of the primaries that took place. Politics, we used to say politics ends at the water's edge. It's not true anymore. Politics and foreign relations seem to be inextricably related in this case. And I don't see any way in which they're going to be unconnected in the near future. So the pressure on the Biden administration to tighten its response towards Israel will continue. The counter pressure in the House of Representatives wanting to continue helping. And just a footnote to all of this, there is some degree of growing annoyance on the part of that small Republican majority in the House of Representatives that the South Africans have overstated their positions, that they seem to be too close to Russia, to Iran, to China, to Hamas, and that is doing the South Africans no good among Americans, shall we say.
Does it matter? I mean, what Benjamin Netanyahu thinks here? I mean, it's reported that he says the U.S. failure to veto the resolution is a clear retreat. Clear retreat are the words that they're using.
Well, Mr. Netanyahu has never been a man who revels in diplomatic nuance. Shall we say? It's he's not somebody who spins a sentence which allows interpretive responses. He puts his view on the table, pounds his fist, and says that's what he believes. And some of what he says presumably is also done for domestic political reasons too. Remember, he has a constituency as well.
Is it just a case of the U.S. realizing that, it can use its veto up until a particular point? I mean, it's used it, 3 times already? And this time around, they just thought, let's just let it pass.
No, well, I think the resolution as it was finally presented represented enough in it that satisfied the Americans, especially with regard to those hostages, and the fact that it is limited in nature, that the government, the administration, felt that this time around, just let this one go through because we're going to continue working government to government. We're going to continue to watch closely the relations, the negotiations that are continuing, and those are, in the current circumstances, more crucial than any UN resolution, I suspect. That's their calculation.
Brooks Spector, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on.